Can you hear me? Oh, hello. Hi. Gosh, that's loud. Morning, everybody. It's lovely to talk to humans. The last time it was to a camera, so this is a real pleasure to be here. So in this series, we've been looking at the Hebrew community that God led out of slavery in Egypt. And we've been looking at them as a model of the kind of church that we at ALC aspire to be. And so far, we have seen that they were a society that really valued gathering together as a community. We've seen that their foundational story of God's redemption really shaped every part of their lives. And we've seen that they loved to worship through song, that they engaged in corporate prayer, that they were directed by God's word and they were led by his spirit. We've seen that they were servant-hearted, and we've seen that they were called to witness to the nations for God. And today we're going to be looking at their lifestyle of caring for the poor and the vulnerable in their community. And we're going to look at how we as individuals and as a whole church might seek to emulate that. So the Hebrews, they come out of Egypt and they've got to set up an entirely new society from scratch. Now, remember, this is a people that has lived their entire lives in slavery. It was a lifestyle that was characterized by dependency on others and mistreatment of human beings. And they have now got to completely recharacterize their community to one where they can live harmoniously with each other, and they can live with freedom, and they can be productive, and they can live dignified lives. And that is a massive cultural shift. And I expect it was one that was very difficult to navigate. But of course, they are God's chosen people, and God knows exactly what they need. So he gives them 613 laws. 613 laws to help them to live free and righteous lives. And there are laws about morality, there are laws about relationships, there are laws about food, about their health, about possessions, about religious practices, even about how to look after their animals. But probably the most pervasive theme of all of them is about looking after the poor and caring for the vulnerable in their society. In fact, there are hundreds of these 613 laws that are specifically about that one topic. And when we look at these laws, it gives us a much better understanding of what the Bible means by the term the poor, because it's a much wider term than just people who don't have enough money. In these Mosaic laws, we see that God's laws are encompassing care, first of all, for the economically poor, which is those who don't have enough finance or material means to look after themselves. But they also cover support for the relationally poor. So that's those who don't have the family support network to look after them. It also covers the aspirationally poor, which could be defined as those who don't have hope or don't have the means to extricate themselves from their circumstances themselves. And finally, of course, the spiritually poor, which in this context would have been those who didn't know the God of Israel. Now you can see the sheer number of laws about this topic make it very clear that God intended this to be a fundamental characteristic of the Hebrew community. But it's the content of the laws, when we look at them, that really reveals that God's heart for the Hebrews was that they should live in financial and social equality, and that they were to be free of the dependency and the exploitation that they'd experienced in slavery. Now remember, at this stage, the Hebrews were a nomadic community, they were agricultural, and wealth was largely measured in terms of how much land or assets you had. And their society was founded on a structure of patriarchal family support. So inheritance went from father to son. So of course, the widows or the unmarried fatherless girls wouldn't really inherit anything, and they wouldn't have any assets of their own. So they were very vulnerable to poverty and to exploitation. And amongst these laws, there are many that God gives for protection for these widows and orphans. There's one in Exodus 22, which I'm just going to read to you. This says, "You shall not take advantage of any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, and they cry out to me, I will hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children shall become fatherless." He doesn't mince his words, does he? You can really see God's heart here. He is passionate that these people must be protected. In fact, his expectation that this charity and generosity and protection should go towards anyone who has become materially support is evident in these laws. In Deuteronomy 15, it says, "If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites, don't be hard-hearted and tight-fisted towards them, but rather be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need." In these laws, you are not allowed to charge any interest on loans to the poor. And if you owned fields, if you owned crops, you had to leave the margins of your fields unharvested so that the poor could come and harvest them themselves. So they had an opportunity for productive, dignified work, so that they could make their own bread and they could feed themselves, or they could sell it for a profit. Essentially, they could provide for themselves and were free from dependency on others. Now, in this Hebrew community, if a debt was too large to pay off, then a Hebrew could actually sell themselves to their creditor as an unpaid worker, as a slave, essentially, until their debt was paid off. Now, despite their status, these bond servants, as they were called, were clearly, God wanted them protected, and he was absolutely clear in his laws that they should be treated with fairness and respect and dignity. It says in Leviticus 25, "If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. You shall not rule over them ruthlessly." And this dignified treatment that he expects extends to visitors too, and to refugees even. Those people had very few possessions, and they of course were outside of the family network, the support system too, and they would have had to rely on the kindness of strangers to look after them. And God's law says that they should be given food, should be given drink, should be given shelter, should be given work, should be given access to basically everything that the Hebrews had access to. And they were to be afforded the same respect as the locals themselves. So you can see, hopefully, from some of these laws I've just shared with you, that being rich in assets or in wealth in this community did not entitle anybody to ignore their social obligations. In fact, the personal amassing of wealth and status is so low down on God's priority list that he creates something called the Sabbath Year, which is every 7 years. And in this 7th year, no one was allowed to harvest their fields. Like, they had to be left alone. And anything that grew in that field was fair game for the poor all year. And in fact, in the Sabbath year, all debts had to be written off. All debts. That includes releasing the bond servants, even if their debts were not fully paid off yet. And not only that, in Deuteronomy 15 it says, "When you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, and out of your winepress." So not only did you have to let these servants go free, you had to write off the debt they owed you, and you had to send them off with some of your stuff. Oh, this is turning the other cheek, isn't it? This is incredible. You see, this is about restoring a balance between rich and poor, constantly, every 7 years, restoring that balance and making sure that the freed remain free and are able to live a life of dignity. The practical concerns for the survival of the vulnerable outweighed any need for excess profits. And that is something we find it very hard to comprehend in our culture, because we are products of a culture that, that we promote nationalism and individualism and each man for himself. But these laws that we see in the first few books of the Bible, they make it absolutely clear what God's heart was for the Hebrews. No doubt at all. But if we look at the rest of the Bible, we can see that his heart for the poor does not change. There are over 2,000 references in the Bible to caring for the economically poor alone. And there are literally thousands of others about caring for the socially vulnerable. And then 15 years or so after Moses, Jesus walks the earth, and you rather than say, do you know what? You don't need to worry about that caring for the needy thing anymore. I've sorted that. Stand down. Not at all. Not only does he reiterate the need, but he ups the stakes. He says to a rich man, don't just give a percentage or a donation. He says, sell everything you have and give it to the poor. And he says to his listeners, when you give to the needy, when, not if, when you give to the needy. Yeah, and he models this in action himself. He met the physical, the emotional, the material, the spiritual needs of people he came into contact with. He spent time with people that need him. He showed love to the unlovable, and he shared peace with the suffering. And in John 14, he says this, I say to you, whoever believes in me will also do the works that I do. Whoever believes in me. This isn't just his disciples, folks. This is all Christians for all time. You and me, our church family. This is a picture of normal Christianity. So it remains as powerful and important a commandment for us today as it was for Moses' community thousands of years ago. So important, in fact, that God gives rewards for doing it. Did you know that? Yeah. In Deuteronomy 15:10, it urges us, give to him freely, and your heart shall not be grudging when you do it. For this, the Lord will bless you in all your work and in all you undertake. Personal blessings are on offer. Now, it's important to understand, of course, that God is rewarding the attitude here, not the amount that we give. You remember the poor widow that gave the little money she had to the temple, and it was a tiny amount, but a big sacrifice. And Jesus commended her for that. But it's difficult, it's counterintuitive to us to give of our money or our possessions when we don't have a lot, or to give of our time when we're really busy. I know that. But I just want to vouch for the fact that these personal blessings, these rewards, are real. During the pandemic, like many families, we had to take a pay cut for a while. And so, we're sorting through our finances, trying to work out what we can cut back, what we can cut out on. And of course, you start looking at your voluntary outgoings. And so at one point, I was looking at our giving, and I was thinking, really tempted. Could we just cut back a little bit here? And this thought popped into my head, like, we need to increase our giving. Now, one of the things we're often asking ourselves is, well, how do we know if God's spoken to us? Well, I would say that if something pops into your head that is so contrary to what you're thinking at the time, and quite honestly is nothing you would want to think, and is going to test your faith and is going to glorify God, then it's probably from him. So, cut a long story short, we increased our giving. And I cannot tell you the blessings that rolled in. It was extraordinary, financial ones, personal ones. They just kept coming in and kept coming in. A good measure pressed down and running over. It was quite extraordinary, and we were very well aware that we were being blessed. This is real, folks. But sometimes we are told that we don't see our rewards on earth. We will wait till we get to heaven, and they will come to us when we get there. But we have no idea what they're going to be. But I think they're going to be significant, because in Matthew 25, Jesus says this, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom that has been prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And he tells us why we get to inherit this whole kingdom. It's not because we read our Bibles loads or we're the most articulate person at the prayer meeting. It's because of this. He says, because I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. And truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. Do you see how important this is to God? And while faith secures our eternity with God, we know that from 2 Corinthians that there will be additional rewards given to us for the deeds that we do through faith when we're on earth. And it seems to me that caring for the poor is going to be a very important part of that. And that shouldn't be a surprise to us, really, should it? I mean, I've just said there's literally thousands of times in the Bible that God's telling us to do it. So if his heart for us to care for the poor is so clear, then we need to ask the question, well, why don't we? What stops us caring for the poor more than we do? Well, there are, of course, all manner of reasons and justifications that we come up with. I'm sure you can think of some in your head. But I just want to call out a few of the most common right now, because I want to, in speaking God's promises over them, I want to see that they are just distractions. And therefore, if they pop into our head, we can rebuke them and we can be free just to listen to God's promptings, even this morning. One of the most common reasons, I think, that we opt out of helping the needy is fear. Fear that we won't have enough time, or fear that we won't have enough money left for ourselves. And if you resonate with that, if you felt yourself feeling that in the past, then listen to the promise of God in Philippians 4:19. He said, God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. Well, sometimes perhaps we just conclude that, it's just not worth it. It'll be wasted on them. They won't be grateful. Or they're just going to misuse what I give them anyway. To that 1 Corinthians 5:8 says, in the Lord your labour is not in vain. As Christians, it's important for us to remember that success is defined by obedience through faith and nothing else. We shouldn't worry whether somebody uses the money we gave them or what we hope they'd use it for. If God told you to do it and you did it, you've done the right thing and you trust the outcome to God. And one of the most prevalent obstacles that I've encountered to helping the poor is actually the attitudes to the poor themselves. And I think sometimes these are influenced by media narratives. In 2015, some of you know, I set up a charity which helped kids who live in poverty, and I was sharing my heart about this with someone, and the response that I got from this person was utterly vitriolic. They literally launched a deluge at me about why I shouldn't help the poor. And in no uncertain terms, I was told they've got themselves into this mess. They've only got themselves to blame. They're scrounging off the state. They're not our responsibility. They're just lazy. They don't deserve help from us. And I was stunned into silence. And those of you who know me will know that's quite a rare thing. So that is absolutely stunned into silence. Now, I'm not on a political soapbox here, so I'm not going to go into the flaws of those accusations, but let's just imagine for a moment that everything that person said was true. Right, let's just imagine every one of those accusations was completely true. Does that mean that we stand down? Exodus 22:27, God is speaking about clothing someone who's cold. And he says this, he says, if he cries to me, I will hear, because I am compassionate. You know, we can reason and politicize why we shouldn't help people as much as we like. But you know, when you're a Christian, helping the poor is much less about reason and politics and who deserves what. And it is simply about compassion. Whatever the reason that people fall into hard times, I don't believe that anyone should be exempt from the mercy and the grace of God. You know, the Hebrews didn't deserve their redemption from slavery. And their ongoing redemption wasn't based on conditions. You know, they kept sinning against God, and they kept grumbling, and they kept making bad mistakes, and they kept being ungrateful, and they kept abusing what he'd given them. And he kept on redeeming them again and again and again. And we didn't deserve Jesus' redemption on the cross either. He died for us in our place when we were sinners. When we were languishing in this mess that we had made ourselves. When we were abusing the world that he gave us to look after. When we were damaging mankind that he told us to love. And yet he offers us free gifts of forgiveness and eternal life to everyone. Even those people he already knew would reject him. And there are no conditions placed on how we have to respond to his sacrifice and his love. He doesn't tell us how grateful we have to be. So who are we to say that anyone doesn't deserve mercy, that doesn't deserve the help to get themselves out of the situation they're in? The appropriate response to the unconditional and merciful love of God is surely just to pass that unconditional and merciful love on to people who need it and leave all the judgment to him. So how do we do this? As individuals and as a church. And who is it that's in need of our care? Well, when we look at the Hebrews as a model, we can see that caring for the poor was done locally. It was done individual to individual, but it also became a characteristic of the whole community. And it was done as a lifestyle, not as an occasional gesture. And that is what we can aim for as a church body that has this ministry at the very heart of everything that we do and of what we are. Now, there is extensive poverty globally and nationally, and there is a part for us and for the government and for industry to play in meeting those needs. That's absolutely true. But today, we're looking at a model of local church in action. Community of believers who helped other people in their local vicinity. And local church is absolutely vital in the mission for the poor. Not because we're territorial or anything, but because there are communities of Christians in every community on earth, practically. And so if the local church is supporting their own communities, then poverty will be tackled globally. Now, our local area is pretty affluent compared to many in the world. You know, we've got nice cars and mowed lawns and good schools. And so it's very easy to believe that there isn't a lot for us to do here. So I find this hard. It might surprise you to hear that last year the councils of Bracknell Forest and Windsor and Maidenhead and Surrey and West Berkshire, they all reported that their residents But they had residents who were victims of modern slavery, 77% of which were children. Sorry. They also reported the presence of homeless and rough sleepers on their streets. 18 families fled Afghanistan and took refuge here in Berkshire just last month. You may not know that, but they are living amongst us now. This building where you are sitting right now is exactly 16 minutes drive from 513 men who are currently in prison as I talk to you. According to those councils I mentioned, we are living amongst people who are hungry, who are lonely, who can't afford the basic living needs of heating and shoes. On the pavements out there, we are passing people who are grieving for loved ones and for broken relationships. At the school gate, we are chatting to folks who are dealing with depression and anxiety and addictions. In the supermarket aisles, we're standing next to adults and kids who are living in fear of abuse. Our children are learning alongside others who are neglected, who are abandoned, who are orphaned, and in some cases socially isolated because of their responsibilities as young carers. At work, we are sitting next to people who are overlooked, who are hopeless, and who are feeling overwhelmed. We fill up our cars next to people who are physically and mentally ill. We have our parcels delivered by victims of prejudice and injustice, and we are served at the till by the heartbroken, and we see none of it. Our British stoicism, our stiff upper lip, has us believing that it is noble to face adversity and pain and hardship without complaint, with our heads held high. That sharing our problems is just to burden someone else. To admit we have a problem in the first place is failure and shameful. And so, as Brits, we deflect our pain with humour, dry humour, and very superficial conversations. People are very, very good at hiding their suffering. And so we don't see it. But it is everywhere. It's right out there. It's in here. And God knows where it is. And all we have to do is to tell him that we are willing to see it and ask him to show us. Now, I had my eyes opened a little bit when I started the charity. I believe that God was specifically asking me to help people who lived kids who lived in this area, who suffered from family poverty. And lots of people, myself included, were like, well, is there really even a need for that here? But I tell you that in the first few months alone, 150 children were referred by local children's services as kids who would benefit from our help. And the first Christmas, I got a card from a lady called Ruby, who said that if it hadn't been for the presents that we had sent her kids, that year she would not have had any Christmas presents for her children at all. And that is right here, in this affluent community. So what do we do about it? How do we as Christians, as the local church, as individuals, how do we make an impact? That's really the question we need to figure out, isn't it? So the first and most important thing that we can all do, and if you hear nothing else this morning, here is that we must stay closely connected to God. In Matthew 22, Jesus pronounces the two most important commandments. He says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbour as yourself. And it is no accident that they're in that order. You know, if we obey the first one, it makes it much easier to obey the second. You know, in our house, I can tell exactly who is walking up and down the stairs just by the sound of their feet, you know, on the tread of the stairs. You know what I mean? You know that in your houses? And that simply comes just from that amount of intimate time you spend with someone. And it's the same way here, you know, if we do that first commandment, if we spend time with God, engaging him in all aspects of our lives, and we invest in building an intimate relationship with him, then we begin to recognize the sound of his voice more clearly. And John 10:27 says, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." You know, spending time with God in that way enables us to better hear his voice, which then makes it possible to follow him towards those neighbours that he wants us to love. If we want to be fruitful in serving the poor, we can start by investing in our relationship with God. That's our training ground. That's where we start. But when it comes to practically serving the poor, well, every individual, every need is obviously completely different, but God may call you into something unusual and unique. That's true, he might. But generally, if we're looking for some sort of practical ideas about how this could be a lifestyle for all of us, then really we can divide our responses into three kind of categories, which are charity, advocacy, and community. Now, by charity, I mean giving of ourselves, our money, yes, but also our time, our skills, our possessions, pretty much anything that people need or that we could bless them through. Now, this can require a real shift of perspective on what we have. 1 Chronicles 29:14 says to us that everything that we have is from God. Everything. It's not to be considered a right or something that we've earned or that we deserve, but that it's something we get to steward wisely for him and for his glory. Like he's given us a tool that we can use to do his work for him. And 1 John 3:17 says, if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. Now, my dad's got a friend, he's 78 years old, and he was lost in a city recently. He was going to meet a friend, he was lost, and it was pouring with rain. And he tells the story that this lady came up to him and asked if he needed any help. And sure enough, she walked with him quite a long way out of her way through the city to show him where to go. And then she left him with her umbrella because he didn't have one. Oh, what a ledge. I mean, wouldn't it be lovely if everybody cared for each other like that? As Christians, we can choose to live like that all the time. But Jesus says we should take it one step further. We shouldn't just react to the needs that we see. He says we should be proactive in seeking out people that we can bless. He says in Luke 14:13, he says, when you give a banquet, invite the poor and the crippled and the lame and the blind. He said we should go out looking for people that we can bless. Now, to live like this, we need to be asking God all the time, day to day, to show us where the need is. And then we need to be prepared to be generous and creative about how we can meet those needs. So let's have a think about some of the things we might have that we can just use day to day to bless people. I say this is beyond the sort of the unusual and the unique that God might call us into. This is your day to day stuff. So have you got a car? If you've got a car, could you give lifts to someone? Have you got some extra food? Could you provide meals for someone who's ill or is on a low budget for a while? Have you got an hour to spare and an ear? Could you just go and be company to somebody for a while? Are you musical? You've got loads of musical people in here. Or can you entertain? Could you go and bring joy to someone that doesn't smile much at the moment? If you've got skills like Paul, can you go and help somebody practically? Or do you have a computer or even a pen? You could write to one of those men down the road that's in prison. If you have a spare room or a spare property, then you could offer a safe, warm space to someone that needs it. You just think, how could you bless people? Through your garden, through your dog, through your kettle, I don't know, anything that you have can be used to bless people. You just need to ask God to fire up your imagination. And please don't underestimate what God can do with the small things that we can offer. You know, you think about the boy who had his packed lunch, offered his packed lunch, and God fed over 5,000 people with it. You know, or this lady with her umbrella that became a story to be passed on, to be shared with you, maybe to encourage one of you to change someone's life, maybe even bring someone to faith. You know, remember Zechariah says, don't despise the day of small beginnings. You know, give God the little we have and he will use it. Now, God may also call some of us into advocacy for the poor, you know, to tackle the systemic and the long-term causes of poverty. Now, if that's you, if he calls you into that, that might mean that you end up needing to educate yourself and others about the issues that you are passionate about. You might get involved with other charities or organisations that need volunteers. You might organise or attend fundraising events. You could campaign. You could raise awareness. But you'll end up becoming a voice for the voiceless and contacting people that can influence change. You'll be standing for the powerless. And if God asks you to do this, he will work through you to effect change. And of course, God calls the church body to gather together to serve our community. And in recent years, Ascot Life Church has supported several organisations and individuals through charitable giving. We've also offered the Hope and Depression course to the local community, and we're currently in the process of setting up a relationship with Christians Against Poverty so that we can hopefully help more people who are in debt and need to find work. But ALC wants to find more ways of practically serving those in need in our communities. And I'm really excited to be part of a church that wants to grow in this ministry. So let's be a people that is led by the Spirit towards the things that God wants us to be involved in and wants us to start up. Listen to his promptings. There is so much potential to serve people in our communities who need it through the church. But ultimately, folks, of course, the best thing we can do for the poor is to share Jesus with them. The best thing we can do for anyone is to share Jesus with them. In Luke 4, Jesus claims of himself, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." Jesus is the ultimate answer to suffering. We, as Christians, must keep giving the hungry food and speaking up for the defenceless. But this goes hand in hand with pointing them to Jesus, who will meet their greatest need, which is to be known and to be loved by God and to know and love him in return. You know, a relationship with Jesus can offer that assurance that we are loved and accepted and valuable, and that we are worth dying for, and that we know we have an advocate to walk through life with us, to fight for us in the midst of those struggles. It can restore dignity. It can bring reconciliation. It can bring peace. It can bring healing. It can break addictions, and it can offer hope that our cries are being heard and that our prayers can be answered. And ultimately, a relationship with Jesus promises an eternal future that is free from pain and sadness. Jesus is the living hope. He is a refuge. Why would we not want to share that with people who are suffering? And God's heart is clearly for the poor. It has been always, and it still is today. And he invites us to partner with him to alleviate that suffering. That is such an honour. And he will use all willing hearts. He loves willing hearts. But if we want to be most effective, then we need to wholeheartedly pursue our relationship with Jesus. The closer we draw to him, the further, the deeper into our broken society he will send us. And he will give us everything that we need to live lives that are generous and fearless. Now, I love music, and I find God often speaks to me through the lyrics of worship songs. And so just as we finish, I just want to share with you some lyrics from a song by Matthew West, which is called Do Something. So I woke up this morning, I saw a world full of trouble. I thought, how do we ever get so far down? And how's it ever going to turn around? So I turned my eyes to heaven. I thought, God, why don't you do something? Well, I just couldn't bear the thought of people living in poverty, of children sold into slavery. The thought disgusted me. So I shook my fist at heaven and I said, God, why don't you do something? And he said, I did. I created you. Amen.